This is kind of building off of some of my recent videos where I've been talking about moral culpability, how people see the world, how history appears to most people. And I'm trying to kind of apply that same logical framework to the media because this is something that's always really bothered me is how and why the media behaves the way it does, in particular journalists. Because I can kind of understand from like your average person because they can't be bothered to learn about a lot of stuff, nor should they. They have more important concerns, their church, their family, their job. They don't, unless they're somebody who just likes knowledge for its own sake and would rather be informed than not be informed. There isn't really a practical reason for them to spend hundreds of thousands of hours studying the great issues of their age when all that's going to be asked of them is to vote once every 4 years in an election that doesn't matter for a party that's not going to do what they say they're going to do. So I get that. I get why they'd have more of just a very overly simplistic attitude towards it, and they just entirely embrace a narrative. The thing, though, that does make me kind of wonder is why is the same attitude so common among academics or like people who have been to university or journalists or people who are better educated and have access to more information and should understand the complexities of a particular situation better? Why is it that they think in more or less the same way, although they dress it up more? Because, like, when you look at a lot of the ways journalists report on things, it's often very clear what source that they used for it, and they can take like part of a source and say this is 100% accurate, and the next line will contradict it in the original source, but they're able to just ignore that. They're able to publish articles that are mutually exclusive within like hours or days of each other, and just none of this occurs to them. And I think if you tried to explain it to them, they would just not, it would just be like they would just blue screen of death. It could not compute. So so that made me start thinking about it, and it can't just be that susceptibility to overly simplistic narratives, or I guess for lack of a better term, NPC thinking, is a result of a lack of knowledge. Because I known people who are not particularly well educated who tend to be more complex in their thinking or more principled or more consistent, and people who probably have a high paper IQ and will have university degrees, but basically are just kind of really smart NPCs, and they will behave in the exact same way when it comes to any issue that displays a degree of subtlety or nuance. And I think I've come with a couple explanations for this. So, first and foremost, most people think in very, very black and white terms. And this might sound kind of weird because I'm frequently been told my entire life that I think in extremely black and white terms. And this is something you will hear a lot about people who ultimately probably do have more nuanced views. And we'll get into why that is. But I think most people, even regardless of education level, see the world in terms of good and bad. And obviously, the further you get away from something and the broader the issue, the more exact it is. And they are just not capable of comprehending that something can be complicated, that someone can be otherwise a good person, but they may be like 30 years ago while they were drunk, they dropped an N bomb. And to like a lot of people, particularly in the media and just the average person, that person could have saved like thousands of people, dragging them out of fires. But the fact that the person dropped an N bomb 40 years ago immediately erases all of that. And that person is 100% evil in their mind. This happens a lot with politicians who misspeak or they say something that people disagree with. Everything else about them will just immediately go away. And they will think that they're the Antichrist. So there's the infamous, I believe it was Vouch who said, I don't care if Joe Biden like keeps kids in his basement and like molests them, I'd still support him, or if he was a serial killer. And when you start to and you can really see this with regards to like politics. Like half of America thinks that Trump is the Messiah, half of America thinks that he is the devil. very, very few people who have anything other than that opinion. And I don't mean necessarily you have to be completely mixed or completely neutral, but you might say, okay, well, I like a lot of the things Trump does, but his personal life is something I greatly disapprove of. His divorces, his affairs, stuff like that. But I think overall he's the best candidate for president because his policies on a macro level are good. And the reality is, most people, I think, just can't think that way. And that includes the media. They can't square the circle that somebody might do something good and somebody might do something bad. They're either 100% good or 100% bad. And you see this in like the interpretation of historical events where there's no nuance or no context. It's just there's good guy, there's bad guy, and ironically enough, if they're taking the perspective that there's not a good guy or a bad guy, they will take that as an absolute perspective as well. Like if you're saying things are relative or complex, they will just take that as an absolute perspective, completely give up on making sense of anything, and just say nothing I can do, and move on with it. Part of what made me think about this was I was watching Tucker Carlson put out a video where he went to a supermarket in Moscow and he talked about how cheap the food was. He also said the city was clean, safe, had nice subways, and stuff like that. And the immediate response was people just went like full freak out, said he was a propagandist, said he was a liar, said, well, even if what he said is accurate, it doesn't matter because of this, and the other parts of the country are bad, and Putin's evil. And basically, the attitude is that he should have lied about it to keep the narrative simpler. You can't have any kind of like nuance. Like you can't say, for instance, like how I feel about Japan. I respect them for being an orderly society. I respect the low crime rate and a lot of aspects of that. But I do think their work culture is messed up. And I think it's bad. And I probably wouldn't want to live there because of that. But you can't have that perspective for most people or if you're in the media. You either have to say Japan is this paradise land or it's this racist dystopia that needs to be destroyed at all costs. And so when you're talking about like Russia, for instance, Putin either has to be like Hitler 2.0 or he has to be like the Messiah or something like that. There's no room for in between. Hitler is obviously the most the example of this, where there's no ability to view him as any kind of historical figure. And if you attempt to put any kind of context into it, like what led him to the way he was, why he made the decisions he did, if you try to dispute the madman Hitler narrative, then you're called a Nazi and people just freak out at you and they have no way to react to an attempt to bring some sort of complexity or nuance to the situation. So I think that people are generally speaking largely incapable of dealing with internal contradiction. That is, that someone can be generally speaking a good person, but they did a couple bad things in their lives. And, or in the inverse, somebody is just good and righteous and everything they do is good and righteous regardless of anything else. And once again, I think one of the first kind of things that really woke me up to this was when the whole like BLM thing was starting. And you would have guys who would just like black guys who would just assault people, they'd kill people, they'd attack cops and stuff like that. And not just cops, but just random people on the street, they'd loot stores. And the media would just make excuses for it. Like when we had Chris Dorner, they called him Django, and the media thought he was like this superhero. And if you try to explain like that he killed minorities, I think the first people he killed was like a black guy and a half black, half Asian woman, and he was like a psycho. That would just not compute. I think to me, probably the best example of this is whenever they would like fire at the cops and the cops would fire back. Like there was a case where like they were shooting, the guy was shooting at like a police car, and they're like, well, the cop shouldn't have fired back because he was trying to shoot out the tires. They should have known that he was trying to shoot out the tires. And it just made me kind of realize that like in those circumstances, there's no capacity for nuance. There's no like you can't have the narrative that, or it's not compatible that some of these people are criminals and some of them aren't. It either has to be kind of one or the other. And you'll find that society, at least in my experience, will generally speaking go from one extreme to another. Like nobody supported gay marriage one day except for a couple like outliers. Then Will and Grace airs, and suddenly just everybody is 100% on board. And if you object to anything, you're evil. Or and this kind of follows in a lot of cases. Like if people accept that like one thing is okay, then everything else within the same category immediately becomes okay as well. And I just think that people within in it some sort of internal idea or internal system are completely incapable of any kind of subtlety or addiction. Obviously, there's a lot of exceptions to it, and there's a lot of counterfactuals, but I'm just trying to think out loud here. A lot of these videos, I don't have an absolute answer. I'm trying to come to a conclusion as well as you. And I think it's at least something to think about. And it's something that maybe next time you see a news story or a narrative or something like that, um, that's kind of the lens you have to see it through. Now, alternatively, people have endless capacity for external contradiction. Now, the distinction between the two can be somewhat difficult, but people are very good in compartmentalizing. To me, one of the best examples of this is if we take the abortion issue. Now, when someone gets pregnant, people are like, "Oh, you're having a baby," and they'll ask like, "Oh, is the baby doing okay? Is what gender is the baby?" That sort of thing. And if the woman miscarries, people will get upset and it's a tragedy. But those same people will support unlimited abortion up to and including birth. And it goes, how can you hold those two views? How can it like it be like a living person? It's a baby, but it's also just a bundle of cells you can kill at any given time. And the normal person will just not be able to see that there is a contradiction between those two positions. And if you try to point that out to them, they'll probably get angry or just say, well, it's different. And they won't really be able to explain why, because those are kind of an external contradiction. Those are two things that they're able to compartmentalize and separate. Like the other major example I find late, there's a lot of the stuff regarding the Russo-Ukraine war is like this. Like you will have journalists who will, in the span of a couple days, or even the same day in the same publication, will publish an article saying 90% of Russia's military capacity has been destroyed. Their economy's in tatters. They're having to like dig through the waste heaps to get chips out of washing machines. But they will also then write an article saying that Russia is a threat to Europe and that they're going to invade Europe in like 6 months and we have no ability to resist them. And they will publish these two articles and they will not, like, if you ask them, they will not be able to see how these two realities are mutually exclusive because there's just enough distance between them that they can compartmentalize them separately. And it's two simple narratives that contradict one another versus one narrative that is complicated. And so the media behaves in the way it does, despite having all this factual information, despite being better educated, because that's just the way that they think. It's for some people, I think it is, they actually do have a more nuanced view of reality and they're just dishonest or they're trying to mislead the public or something like that. And once again, this may not be the case. I may be exaggerating this. People might be a lot smarter and more insightful than I give them credit for, but it's kind of irrelevant because this is the way the media acts. So we can either explain the underlying phenomenon or we can explain the assumptions that the media operates under. So the media behaves the way it does because to most people, like facts don't matter, internal contradiction doesn't matter, consistency doesn't matter. None of these things are important. What's important is does this person, this event, this thing fit into the good box or the bad box? And there is nothing in between that. And any attempt to introduce any shade of gray in that will necessarily make them have like a shutdown and they'll often get angry at you and start yelling at you, or their response will be like, why are you a Nazi? Why do you want to shoot blacks and stuff like that? I think another one that's really made me think about this a lot is you have this like narrative, these two narratives, which is to me schizophrenic, but that's just me. Where the one is, well, you have to accept immigrants because you were an immigrant to North America. And I just like, okay. But the narrative is also that we're settlers and colonists who exterminated the native population. It's like, but you can't say both. You can't say like immigration's great because look at this example in which the immigrants completely destroyed the native population and reduced them to basically squalor. And you cannot explain that to someone because it is compartmentalized. They are too distinct from each other to try to if you try to explain that, they will just look at you like you grew a second head and say that you're a racist and that you support Trump and you believe in QAnon is the reaction they will probably have. And so the media behaves the way it does because that's the most effective way to behave. And it doesn't really matter if they behaved otherwise. They could give context to things, they could provide actual facts, they could provide, but people don't care about that. People, unfortunately, don't think in that way. And if you were to insert that, it wouldn't matter. And I think the problem with a lot of these things is it's very difficult to empathize or to kind of at least from a intellectual a curiosity standpoint, to adopt a perspective that's completely alien to yours. So myself and probably a lot of people who watch this channel don't think in that way. They don't think in like 100% binary fashion. So trying to see other people having that thought process is almost impossible. It's and it's why a lot of people in these circles get so frustrated because they try to go to people they would call the normies or whatever, and they have all these facts and they have all this information and they can point out internal contradictions, and it just doesn't do anything. The person like is an NPC. They just you will give them like something and they just have a pre-programmed response that they will give, and it's just something that's almost impossible to accept because it is so different from the epistemological way that you view the world. And I think you just have to kind of do that. And I think part of the problem, and this is an issue I have, is as a Christian, I'm supposed to be compassionate towards people. I'm not supposed to give into the sin of pride. There's a lot of just cringy, dickish people who talk about that feel when too intelligent or like once again make the normies pay and stuff like that. But the reality is there's a lot of truth to that, and you can't just instinctively reject that because it's adopted by a lot of really cringy people who aren't as smart as they think they are. The reality is there is fundamental differences within people, and it's not necessarily down to race or culture, or religion, or anything. There just seems that there are some people who are able to tolerate complexity and those who aren't. I'm not sure what the reason for that exactly is. And maybe I'll think about that in time. My personal thought is that most it's actually a negative for a lot of people from a I don't know if an evolutionary or sociological standpoint, because not everybody can be a philosopher, not everybody can be a social scientist or whatever, or even a scientist or an engineer or something like that. You need a lot of people in society who will do kind of the other stuff, and perhaps being able to think in a more complex fashion and having the desire for self-actualization in certain ways is actually makes it a lot harder to do that. Maybe if you thought you were able to think more critically, you couldn't do a factory job or something like that. Anyways, I'm just throwing a lot of ideas out there. I hope people found that interesting. Post down below and let me know what you think. But God bless everybody and try to stay safe out there.